evening. My name is Shakti Sinha. I am the director of the Nehru Memorial Museum and Library. On behalf of publishers, HarperCollins India, and NNML, it will be a great pleasure to welcome all of you for the book release, Reimagining Pakistan, Reforming a Dysfunctional Nuclear State. I'm sure some of you have already picked up the book. There are enough copies left for the others. I will not really speak on the book because we are going to have a very good discussion. All I can say is that over the last many years, 7 decades, the two countries in many ways have moved very differently. The 1971 elections in India, midterm elections Mrs. Gandhi had called, was won on the slogan Garibi Hatao. The 1980 elections was lost by the Janata Party after the split on the price of onions. The 1998 Delhi Assembly elections, the BJP lost again on the price of onions. History repeating itself 20 years. And subsequently, all our elections have been basically driven by economic issues. Politically also, diplomatically also, we think of ourselves differently. Obviously, the USA and China, followed by Japan, are our most important countries. On the west, we have Saudi Arabia, Israel, and the GCC countries. On the east, we have ASEAN and Vietnam and Singapore in there, etc. But of course, your neighborhood is very, very important. And I think it's in our interest to understand a little bit more about our neighbors. And I think Mr. Haqqani's earlier works also, and I have read all of them. I should have brought them for signing, but next time I'll do that. They are a mine of information, not just information, but analysis. And for those who think it's all Pakistan bashing, it is not. Where he pulls no punches, where he feels that India has done wrong, which is what a good scholar is supposed to be. And which is what I would commend all of you to read the book, and those who are not here. And again, which is why the moment the idea of the book release came up, I said we'll be more than happy to play a small role in it, because I do feel it is our job here at NNML to create a vibrant platform for discussions, for ideas to be thrown out, thrown up, dissected, etc. With that, let me not take more time and invite Odin from HarperCollins. Oh, where are you? Here, please. Odin will now come up, and then we start the ball rolling. And once again, as I said in the beginning, please keep your phones on silent mode. We know you have a lovely phone. Thank you.
Thank you, Shakti ji. And very pleasant evening, very pleasant good evening to all of you. My name is Odin Mitra. I am publisher literary at HarperCollins Publishers India. And very proud to have published Ambassador Haqqani's new book, Reimagining Pakistan. It's my pleasant duty to very quickly introduce the book and the author. But even before that, it's my pleasant duty to invite on stage Ambassador Husain Haqqani and Suhasini Haidar, diplomatic editor at The Hindu, who will be in conversation with Mr. Haqqani.
And I must add that we are very fortunate that Mr. Ajay Bisaria, our Safir in Islamabad, is here with us.
So as Ambassador Haqqani and Suhasini settle down, let me just very quickly introduce Mr. Husain Haqqani to you. He is one of the world's best renowned and most important commentators on Pakistan today. As many of you know, he served as Pakistan's ambassador to the United States from 2008 to 2011. He's also served as advisor to 3 Pakistan prime ministers. Mr. Haqqani currently lives in the USA, where he is a senior fellow and director for South and Central Asia at the Hudson Institute. And as Shaktiji mentioned, Mr. Haqqani is the author of 3 previous books: Pakistan Between Mosque and Military, Magnificent Delusions, which is a book about Pakistan and the US, and India versus Pakistan, Why Can't We Just Be Friends? All 3 books, though none of them are published by HarperCollins, are definitely worth reading. So if you haven't, then please do. The new book is available for sale outside and in bookstores everywhere. If you haven't picked up a copy, please do pick up a copy. Right after this, Mr. Haqqani will be happy to sign copies if you have copies to sign. So what is this new book about? Pakistan is 70 years old. It turned 70 along with India last year. To the world, Pakistan has been something of a conundrum, armed with nuclear weapons, often dominated by the military, sometimes said to be the home of militants. It's been seen, especially internationally, it's often been seen as an unsettled, unruly nation. It has been called the most dangerous place on earth. But was this what Pakistan was supposed to be? Was this, when Pakistan was created in 1947, is this what it was meant to be? What was the ideology behind its creation? And if things have gone wrong, where have things gone wrong and why have they gone wrong? So that is what the new book, Mr. Haqqani's new book, Reimagining Pakistan, really charts. It delves into history in a really fascinating way. And it shows the failings that Pakistan has been repeatedly prone to. And eventually he argues for a bold reconceptualization of the ideology of the nation itself. As Shaktiji said, this is not a Pakistan bashing book. This is a book looking to the future of Pakistan and of global politics, because in global politics, Pakistan has a significant role to play, and that is not just in South Asian politics, it's beyond as well. And Pakistan has 210 million citizens, many of whom were born after 1947. And they want to see their country being great. And in many ways, this is a book that lays out a blueprint for how that greatness can be achieved and how Pakistan can take the first steps, at least, towards becoming itself. So that is it for me. Suhasini will be in conversation with Mr. Haqqani. But before I hand over to Suhasini, may I ask you both to unwrap the first copies of the book? This is the very first launch of the book. Shaktiji, please join them. Yes. This is the very first launch of the book in Delhi. From here, we move on to other cities, but wanted to be in Delhi for the first one. Thank you. And before I get off stage, just a word of thanks. I don't want to take up time with a vote of thanks at the end. So thanks to our partners, event partners, NMML. Wonderful facility. Always a pleasure to be here. And over to you, Suhasini.
Thanks a lot, Mr. Mitra, as well as Mr. Sinha. And thanks a lot for coming out this evening. You know, as a nation, we're accused by everyone of being over-obsessed with Pakistan. Certainly when we go to any international fora, all we talk about seems to be Pakistan. Pakistan certainly seems to think we're obsessed with Pakistan, and some of its obsession comes just from that idea. But the problem I always feel with a lot of our writing and a lot of our understanding of Pakistan is that it ends at our borders and our LOC with them. The fact is we only focus as Indians on India's relationship with Pakistan and not on Pakistan itself. What makes it what it is? Why has it changed? If, as Husain says in his book, 95% of Pakistanis today have only known a Pakistan, have only been born in a Pakistan, can everything that we see about Pakistan be defined by India or its partition from India? And how can Pakistan's behavior that we obviously have problems with, how can that change? But not for us, for Pakistanis themselves. I can't describe Husain Haqqani just as a Pakistani author, as a Pakistani author said, because he's so many, more parts than that. He was Pakistan's ambassador to the United States. He has been a journalist. He has been a politician. We will find out by and by that he was also a student activist. And he originally moved to Pakistan from India. He remains someone committed to South Asia, but is spending a lot more time on this side of the border in LOC than on that side. In fact, we joked earlier that India's High Commissioner from Islamabad may have been slipped a little note from the Pakistan Supreme Court asking for Husain to be brought back with him. But the truth is, he writes about Pakistan as a Pakistani with a lot of self-awareness, a lot of understanding of Pakistan. Every country in that sense deserves to have at least one Husain Haqqani who's able to look at his country with love, but from an outsider's point of view as well, and say, this is where you are going wrong, especially in our times today, where to say anything against one's country, no matter what part of the world you're in, straight away brands you as someone who's an anti-national, someone who does not deserve to be listened to. Because how can you criticize your own country, especially on an international sphere? How can you criticize or find holes in your own country? Sitting here in India, for example. But as I said, it's what comes through in most of Husain's writings is that deep faith in Pakistan and its ability to become something really great. It hasn't deterred him that there is trouble for him back home. And he's here in India with what I call a trilogy. I know you had India versus Pakistan in there, but that falls into the first category of what I was talking about. The real trilogy is, of course, Between Mosque and Military, Magnificent Delusions, which focuses a little more on the relationship with the international world, and particularly with the United States, and now Reimagining Pakistan. Husain, if I could just ask you to start with, you've said in this book that this book has been in your mind for 20 years. What happened 20 years ago that made you start thinking about how Pakistan could reimagine itself?
Thank you, Suhasini. Before I go there, let me just start with your comments about Pakistanis being obsessed with India, India being obsessed with Pakistan. Mahatma Gandhi at the time of partition said that this is a separation between members of the same family who have now decided that instead of being a joint family, they'll be a separate family. So obviously, family members do have an intense concern with one another, and that can be described or seen as an obsession by others. Pakistan's founder, Muhammad Ali Jinnah, had said, well, after the initial passions are over, we will live like United States and Canada. So nobody had envisaged that 5,000 years of togetherness will be overtaken by 70 years of to such an extent that we will not be able to understand and know each other as well as we ought to. And you said that my roots are here. By the way, I was born in Pakistan, and I'm writing as someone who's part of the 95% of Pakistan's population that did not see partition, but only has a transmitted memory of partition. And I contest that transmitted memory is flawed, because that sows the seeds of a lot of poison on both sides. And I'm somebody who has expressed a lot of concern about what I have described as the Pakistanization of India, that it may have happened in Pakistan first, but it's now happening in India. And a manufactured or a fabricated or a tailored history is being created that is actually poisoning the well here as well. So that is the context, and that's where I come from. Now, why did this book come to my mind when it did? Well, I found myself on stage in America at the University of Michigan at an event in which Salman Rushdie was also present. And you know Mr. Rushdie, he doesn't mince his words, and he doesn't have much affection for Pakistan, sadly. So he made a comment that famous constructivist author Benedict Anderson has described nations as imagined communities. There's a very famous book called Imagined Communities, and he says that nations are imagined communities. And he said, if nations are imagined communities, Pakistan is a poorly imagined country. So I responded to it and I said, well, the thing about imagination is that imagination is infinite. So if something is poorly imagined today, it can certainly be well imagined tomorrow. To which Mr. Rushdie replied, well, Mr. Haqqani, if Pakistan has to be reimagined, then somebody like you will have to work on reimagining it. And I, of course, not only heard him, but decided that I will start working on that process of reimagination. So for 20 years, I have been putting things away in folders. First, they used to be paper folders. Then they became electronic folders on my computer, in which I kept putting information and ideas that related to this whole process of reimagining. And my argument was that actually, at the time of independence, the people who led Pakistan to its creation had not really thought through the process very much. And that comes, there's a whole chapter in my book that describes what happened based on documents from that era. For example, Pakistan decided on its capital just a few months before independence. Now, even if you say that in June 1947 the partition plan had been announced, the Muslim League should have been ready with a plan for where it's going to have a capital. And they didn't. And they decided at the last minute that they are going to make Karachi the capital, even though the British advised that make Lahore, because half of Lahore is going to become empty from people who will be moving to East Punjab, the government. And so you will have more space there to have an interim capital. The Muslim League chose Karachi. And Karachi was a very small city at that time, and it had only been the capital of Sindh for only a few years. And so it didn't have the wherewithal for a big government. Now in Pakistan, as children we were told, and it's a true narrative, that civil servants used to sit on old boxes, and instead of using paper pins, they used to use thorns from the trees of kikar which grew around Karachi. And that is true. But my perspective was, but we could have avoided it, couldn't we, if we had imagined it better? So that's how I've been working on it for all these years, thinking about what are the things that we feel which were wrongs done to us, which may have been avoided if we had only thought things through differently. And that's what this book has turned out to be, a reimagination of not only what it was meant to be, but what it ought to be. Because very frankly, I don't see anybody in India wanting an undoing of what happened. There is sadness among some people. They say it shouldn't have happened. But I don't think anybody wants to go back and change things. So, and they can't be changed. 200 million people in Pakistan have grown up as Pakistanis. We think of ourselves as Pakistanis. We have known no other identity except Pakistani. So therefore, all we can do is think of things differently and build a future that is very different from the past.
All right. I do want to come to the book, and particularly your portrayal of Jinnah as the person who didn't quite imagine Pakistan completely. But I do want to ask about your own journey. You know, many say, I don't know who Haqqani is. You've yourself written about your original leanings as a student. You were part of the Jamaat. You have been an advisor to so many prime ministers across the political spectrum. And eventually an envoy for the Zardari government. What really molded your movement? Was it just politics?
So I think I have had the journey of any Pakistani who has had some opportunities, but who is not born into Pakistan's elite. I may have married into it, but I've not been born into it. I come from a family that didn't have roots in Pakistan and didn't have much means. My father was the only member of his family who migrated from Delhi to Karachi, and the rest of his family had chosen to stay behind. So he was a lonely figure in that sense. My mother's family were all very staunch Muslim Leaguers, so they all were in Pakistan, and so we had a relatively difficult childhood in terms of economic availability of economic opportunities and resources. And I was somebody who was responding to his circumstances at any given moment. So for example, much is made, and a lot of it has to do with, so a lot of things about me are circulated mainly in the last few years because of the fact that I have taken on the Pakistani establishment. So they keep digging out stuff and say, oh, and by the way, he did this also. Sure, I did that, but it was part of the growing up process. The reason why I was with the Islami Jamiat-e-Talaba, which is the student wing of the Jamaat-e-Islami in Pakistan, is because in the time I was growing up in Karachi, that was the only show in town. They were the only force on campuses when I was a student. And I have always had a, so the answer to your question, who is Husain Haqqani? Husain Haqqani is somebody who asks questions and tries to answer them. And I have spent a lifetime asking questions and seeking answers. And working with different prime ministers, etc. Each time I have learned something that I have moved on to the next level. So for example, I may have started out with Mr. Nawaz Sharif when Mr. Nawaz Sharif was a protege of the Pakistani military. But then I soon realized that proteges of the Pakistani military cannot really be full Democrats. And he wasn't at that time. And of course, I learned it firsthand a few years later, because in his second term, he decided to put me behind bars and have me beaten up. And so my answer to my own question was correct, that he had that streak. He has come a long way because people change, and I have great acceptance of that change. And over the years, I have thought things through and come up with answers to many questions. And the biggest question I see for Pakistan is that a transmitted ideology prevents people from being original thinkers. So there is a reason why, for example, UNESCO publishes an annual list of every nation and the number of book titles that it publishes in a year. And Pakistan, as a nation of 200 million, should have far more books written in it than, say, for example, Romania, which has a smaller population. But the truth is that Romania publishes more books than Pakistan. Greece, which has a population of only 12 million, publishes more books every year than Pakistan does. And the only explanation I have for that is not that Pakistanis are not creative, because those of us who do write, we write pretty well. And even our fiction writers are wonderful, the English language fiction that we write. But the fact is that when you have a culture of conformity, then new things are not written. And so I have been somebody who challenges that culture of conformity, and I'm rather proud of it.
All right. I'm going to take advantage of your candid answers and ask you then about a little more about this journey. You've yourself spoken about the fact that your family was a Muhajir family, or your father came across from India, and that came with its own suspicions in Pakistan at a certain time. Today, you're a wanted man in Pakistan, and I know I've made some references to it, but it is a serious charge against you. It is difficult for you to go back to Pakistan right now. How does one work that balance that I'd referred to earlier, where when you criticize your country, you're seen as a traitor, yet you want to continue to do that? How do you work that?
First of all, I am a firm believer in the maxim, my country, right or wrong. But people forget that that is only half of the statement, and I actually cite it in my book. The original statement by an American statesman was, my country, right or wrong, to set right when wrong, to keep right when right. So basically, if you feel that your country is going in the wrong direction, then real patriotism is to challenge that and to question that. And so I think I'm on the right track there. As far as being hounded or first of all, I don't think that at this particular stage in time, when Pakistan's own credibility as a state is rather weak around the world, I am particularly worried about what the Pakistani state does. I mean, even if Mr. Bisaria had been kind enough to deliver the Supreme Court of Pakistan summons to me on behalf of, in an attempt to try and improve relations between the two countries, the chances are, A, that the summons would be very poorly written, because I jokingly said that, I mean, the state Supreme Court of Pakistan says that it has issued a summons, but I've never received it they know where I live in Washington, so they could have stuck it in the mail, but they didn't. It's a culture of just point scoring on evening television shows. That's what it's all about. Otherwise, legally, I don't think I have serious charges to answer. As far as treason is concerned, you know, there's a great joke by a famous Pakistani author, Mushtaq Ahmad Yusfi, who writes in his book, and he writes humor. So he says that a friend of mine and I were walking somewhere, and he called somebody a bad word. I turned around and said, "Why are you using such a harsh word?" And he said, "Oh, well, it was a harsh word when it applied only to one or two people. Now that it applies to a lot of people, it has lost its harshness." The same applies to this label of traitor in Pakistan. It has been applied to so many people now that it has lost its value that it might have had at one time. A country can have one or two traitors, but if you're going to call hundreds of thousands of people as traitors, then very frankly, you have a problem, they don't.
As I said, this is really part of this trilogy that Husain has written about. And according to Husain himself, and I think I have to agree with you, this is the best.
Thank you
because
very much.
It brings together the threads of what Husain tells you through his other works as well. You know, he brings together what he tells you about the 40s, the 50s, the 60s, what every decade has meant for Pakistan and what it has done to Pakistan and what every leader has done as well. In your recounting of the 40s, Jinnah actually cuts a very strangely tragic figure, because you almost portray him as this man who really was pushing for something, never expecting to win. And once he won, he wasn't sure which way he wanted to go. After all, he asked for Pakistan on the basis of Islam, on the basis of a home for Muslims. But on 11th August 1947, his speech actually said, no, this is a country for absolutely everyone, and you know, everybody is equal in this country. Tell me a little bit about how you see Jinnah, because it's very different from what
It's very interesting that
the
11th of August speech has a phrase in it, which is, in fact, a couple of phrases in it that are very interesting. And you know that this was the speech that was suppressed in Pakistan, because even though the country had been created and he was the Governor General and he was the founder, and to this day every currency note in Pakistan has his picture and every official building has his photograph in it, but his own speech was suppressed and they decided not to run it on state radio after the first broadcast. He said that over time, the angularity, this was the term he used, angularity of minority and majority will end. We asked for Pakistan as a solution for the constitutional problem of India, because there would have been a constitutional problem, because there would have been a permanent minority and a permanent majority, because in his opinion the Congress only represented Hindu interests and the Muslim League represented Muslim interests. And so he said, but now the two states of India, he called Pakistan and Hindustan, the two states of India, need to move forward. And over time, Hindus will cease to be Hindus and Muslims will cease to be Muslims, not in a religious sense, for that is everybody's personal choice, but in a political sense. And then he went on to say that religion will have nothing to do with the business of state. These are his exact words. So, how does a man who makes that speech make all the speeches before that in which he's actually demanding the division of the subcontinent on the basis of religion? Aisha Jalal, who's a famous Pakistani historian, has written a book called Soul Spokesman, in which she explains the background. And the way she frames it, and I don't 100% agree with her, because one can't always simplify these things, but basically the Muslim League was a political party. And it was competing for power and influence with another political party called the Indian National Congress. And the Muslim League had a special attitude towards British power, which was very different from the Indian National Congress's attitude towards power. And in that whole environment, the demand for Pakistan came about. And there were many attempts to try and find middle ground, including the Cabinet Mission Plan of 1946. None of that was acceptable to the Congress leadership. And even Mr. Jaswant Singh in his book on Mr. Jinnah actually makes that point, that it was the Congress party's perspective that either we are the representatives of India as a whole, because we don't believe in communal representation, or we end up with what we have. So that's how partition occurred. And Mr. Jinnah was a popular leader, and by the way, I think there is a message here for popular leaders, and that is that sometimes you can end up demanding things that might actually end up happening, and you may not be prepared for what you were actually demanding. And that's exactly what happened here. And as far as the Muslim League is concerned, so there are thousands of pages of documents from the British were meticulous note takers. So every meeting they had with an Indian leader, they would then go and, I guess in those days they had Indian stenographers, so they would just dictate to them, probably people who took shorthand, because they're so elaborate. I just finished a meeting with X, and this is what he said, and then this is what I said, and then this is what he said. So it's like, and obviously that wasn't happening while the meeting was taking place. It wasn't being instantly tape recorded. But all those notes tell a very interesting story of how many Muslim League leaders. For example, there was a gentleman by the name of Khaja Nazimuddin, who became Pakistan's second Governor General after Mr. Jinnah and second Prime Minister, very prominent Bengali politician. And he was asked, please tell me what does Pakistan mean? He said, I don't know what Pakistan means, and I don't think anybody else in the Muslim League does either. I mean, this is what he's telling his British interlocutors, but we want it. And so that whole environment of confusion, I actually describe it not to be mean to the historic figures, but to explain to the young generation and to the current people that, look, what you're taught in schools in India as well as in Pakistan, because the way Indians think of partition is a certain way. It is like, a British conspiracy of which Muslim League and Mr. Jinnah were a part. And then in Pakistan, it is how, it was the greatest idea ever. Maybe we all need to calm down and have a look at it as one of those things that happens in history without too much forethought. And so now what we have to do is put that forethought into the future rather than insisting that it existed in the past. And a lot of what has happened in Pakistan is that the Pakistani national narrative is about attributing forethought to where forethought didn't exist. So trying to explain everything as a very coherent ideology. This is what we intended to do. And so therefore an ideology has been crafted for Pakistan rather than Pakistan having been crafted by ideology.
In fact, you're right at one point that the coat was sewed around the button in a sense. And even how the explanation for how Pakistan was formed on a certain night, something out of the Quran, which had nothing to do with the actual fact.
And that was done a couple of years later. So in Pakistan, we are told, and it's in school books as well, that Pakistan was created on Laylatul Qadr, which is the very special night of Ramadan, of prayer. And the fact is that Laylatul Qadr was actually a day earlier. But, and very frankly, many of the people who were involved in the exercise weren't particularly religious, so they didn't even realize that it was Laylatul Qadr the day before. And they had scheduled a lunch on the day of Pakistan's creation without realizing that it was Ramadan. And one of the ADCs to the founder of Pakistan informed him that this is Ramadan, so we can't have lunch. And so therefore a dinner was arranged, and the dinner had to be fixed at a time that was after sunset, except Lord Mountbatten didn't want to be there after sunset because he wanted to fly back to Delhi, and in those days flying at night was a little uncomfortable and inconvenient, and he wanted to do it in daylight. So it was just, that all those little details. And I spent a lot of time, Suhasini, in the US Congress Library, the famous Library of Congress, which has everything you can think of in printed word. And they have newspapers going back to Dawn, which was the Muslim League newspaper published since 1941. So I just kind of read the whole newspaper in sequence. And by the way, I recommend that to young scholars here, that sometimes that's a great way of doing research, because that gives you a sequential idea of how events were and how they were being reported at the time. And if newspapers are the first draft of history, you should always consult the first draft. And so I looked through all of that, and there are all these little snippets which actually give you a feel for, oh, what was happening at that time. For example, Pakistan celebrates its Independence Day on the 14th of August. And the argument is that 14th of August is when this transfer of power ceremony took place in Karachi. The truth is that Pakistan's first postage stamps all declared, India and Pakistan became independent on the same day, according to the law that gave us independence. Both became on midnight of 15th of August. But it was convenient for Lord Mountbatten, who was going to be the new Governor General of India and the last Viceroy to both countries. He couldn't be in both places at the same time, so he decided he's going to be in Pakistan on the 14th and then fly over and be here on the 15th. But Independence Day is the same, and Pakistan celebrated its first Independence Day in 1948 on the 15th of August. However, later somebody came up and said, but if we are two different countries, how can we have the same Independence Day? So let's change that and do it on 14th of August. So from 49 onwards, Pakistan started celebrating its Independence Day on the 14th of August, just to be different. And I point that out, not out of malice, because I understand what they were thinking, but to try and tell a younger generation of Pakistanis as well as a younger generation of Indians that some of the differences were invented later. As you say, the coat was sewn around the button. And so let's just dial it down a little bit and understand what the differences may be and what the differences are that are contrived and invented and not real, so that we can have a basis for a relationship that is a little more normal as we go forward.
Okay, I know that we need to also go further into the future after this and take some questions from the audience. But essentially what you're saying is be careful what you wish for, because you might actually get it. Is that actually Pakistan's problem over the decades? They wanted a separate state, they got a separate state. And I'm just being the devil's advocate here and saying Pakistan said it wanted to be equal to India when it came to weaponry. The United States helped out. Pakistan said, I want to have a nuclear deterrent because India is getting one. China helped out. Over the decades, every time Pakistan looked for some kind of, something to kind of take it up to the next notch, somebody or the other came and helped, and it happened. Is Pakistan's problem that, in a sense, it was a figurative sort of spoiled child?
Well, I wouldn't go that far, but what I would say is that you are right, that in certain areas they got what they wished for, but in certain areas they didn't. And I cite a lot of statistics in this book. In fact, one of the criticisms, one of my friends who looked at the manuscript, he said, there's too many numbers in it, because this person doesn't like numbers. And I said, well, some of those numbers are necessary. People need to read where Pakistan stands in a range of things. Because look, Pakistan is the 6th most populous country in the world. It has the world's 6th largest army. It has the world's 6th largest nuclear arsenal. Yet, it is number 42 by size of GDP on a nominal basis, and number 26 in the size of GDP on a PPP basis, purchasing power parity basis. That is a very stark imbalance. Similarly, I have statistics about literacy figures, about education figures. For example, Nepal is, compared to Pakistan, tiny. Nepal is about 24, 25 million people. Pakistan is 210 million. Yet, there are more Nepalese students studying in America today than Pakistani students. The number of Nepalese who go to university after completing secondary school is, as a percentage of the total population, as a percentage of the number who complete secondary school, more Nepalese end up in university than Pakistanis do. These are statistics that are staggering. Pakistan last week was identified, and that statistic I couldn't put into the book because that came out only last week. Otherwise, I would have stuck it in. But Udayan wouldn't have allowed me to do that because the book had to be printed at some point, and so there was like a date. And he said, I submitted the manuscript actually like in the nick of time. You know, I said it'll come on such and such date. And they kept sending me letters, emails saying, where's the manuscript? Is it coming? Is it coming? And I didn't respond to any of those emails except on that particular day at about midnight in Washington. I just emailed it to them, the whole thing. So they were, on the one, pleasantly surprised.
So 1 year your book, right day next year, right?
Yeah, we have to. But UNICEF came up with this statistic last week. And as a Pakistani, it worries me. They come up with annual statistics of countries and their infant mortality rates. You would expect that the worst infant mortality rate figure in the world would be that of Congo. But it's of Pakistan. Pakistan has a higher infant mortality rate now than even Afghanistan. And so these are the things that worry me, that make me say, you know what? Having what you wish for, nuclear weapons, a huge army, ability to sort of, look India in the eye, etc., is one part of it. The other part of it is what's happening to the people of Pakistan and what future are we building for ourselves? Low literacy and low education and low university output basically means that we will not have a very bright future in productivity and being a successful nation going forward. And that's why I want us to change our view of how we should run our country and what priorities we should give to ourselves. Now, just a word of caution before somebody says, criticizing Pakistan. No, India has certain issues on some of those things as well. Sure. India's human development indicators also need improvement. So do the human development indicators of all of South Asia, with the exception perhaps of Sri Lanka and maybe Bangladesh, which is improving. But that said, somebody else's misfortune should not be an excuse for your generating a misfortune for yourself. And that is what my real critique of Pakistan is about. I don't like the word criticism. I don't criticize my country. I critique it. Okay. And that's what I want it to be understood as. It should be understood as pointing out things that I have deliberately been kept out of the mainstream discussion in Pakistan.
All right. So let's talk about the thing about Pakistan that you critique the most, and that's the army. Interestingly, your book doesn't really have too much, as the mosque and military does, about the military's role per se. There's a chapter that kind of deals with it. There are bits about what the military does. General Zia's role is dealt with in rather strong detail. But the question, would Pakistan, would we have this conversation if Pakistan did not have this military?
So first of all, yes, this is the first time in my book that I don't spend too many pages talking just about the military. I talk about the military, but I talk about the military in the context of the bigger picture. It's something that is the result of circumstances that Pakistan was created under. Pakistan received, at the time of partition, Pakistan comprised 19% of British India's population, 17% of its revenue sources. So 17, but 33% of British India's army. So the army was disproportionately larger to everything else that the country received. In terms of assets, we were supposed to get 17% of the assets. We got a little less because Sardar Patel took the position that now that Pakistan is at war with us, why should we give the assets? And of course, Gandhiji disagreed with him vehemently and even went on a fast to try and give Pakistan its assets. Because most of the assets were located here. The Reserve Bank of India was here. The government was all in Delhi. But 33% of the army. And the only single functional institution, a functional apparatus that Pakistan inherited was the army, because it had the northern command of the British Imperial Army located in Rawalpindi. So the northern command headquarters overnight became general headquarters of Pakistan. And the first concern of Pakistan was, how do we pay for this large military? Now, if I had been around and had been a lieutenant of Qaid-e-Azam, I would have turned around and said, on the first day of the speech, disband the army. Because after all, in your vision, we are going to be friends with, the two states of Hindustan are going to be friends with one another, or put it under joint command. Instead, we landed with a situation where, unlike other countries that raise an army to match the threat they face, we had an army and had to raise the threat to match the size of the army. And so, the army's political dominance is actually a function of that reality. If instead of 33% we had received 15% or 19% of the British Indian Army, proportionate to our size, then that dominance would not have happened. But then that dominance was compounded. It was compounded by the mistakes of our politicians, because from 47 to 58, the army didn't control everything. 51, they started meddling. But the politicians could have taken a different direction. But instead of that, they also liked the idea. My theory is, having worked with the people that I've worked with, politicians like having a military secretary and a ADC, and they like these guys in uniform looking after, and then they like the guys serving them lunch and tea in fancy silver trays, and standing to attention. That's the Pakistani political case. You were lucky. Jawaharlal Nehru decided early on that these little things are not going to be there. So your mantris didn't fall into this little thing of having a fancy little vehicle driven by a man in a khaki uniform and another guy sitting in front. We have that. And it's such a temptation to let go. So it's not just the military that is responsible for the military's political role, it's also the political class and the elite.
And that is the case you make throughout the book, that stop blaming just the military, but what about the people who tolerate it?
Actually, I'm hoping that the Pakistani military, which totally hates me for Pakistan between mosque and military, will actually, for the first time, if they care to read, they will realize that I am this time saying something slightly different, and that is, the military is also, and its role is also, the product of how Pakistan looks at the world, or how Pakistanis have framed their worldview.
That's right.
And our worldview is framed by being a country under siege. Everybody's our enemy. We are under threat. Now, if you're a Sunni Muslim in Pakistan these days, you look upon Iran as a source of threat. There's exporting Shiaism. If you are a sort of Pashtun, you think that, oh God, we are under pressure from other sources. Then there's this whole view about Israel posing a threat to Pakistan, because after all, why would Israel want a Muslim country to have nuclear weapons? India, of course, is an eternal threat. Afghanistan has become a threat because they want to take. So basically it reminds me of a sher of Daag Dehlvi, which is that, sab hasi hain zahidon ko napasand. Sab hasi hain zahidon ko napasand, ab koi hoor aayegi inke liye. So we've become equal opportunity
threat perceivers.
Threat perceivers. Everything and everybody. Now America is conspiring against us. China, we haven't got there yet, but it'll come. It'll come. There'll be all these. There'll be. It'll happen. So how can a nation actually be a prosperous modern nation if all it thinks is that the whole world is conspiring against it?
You've done what very few historians would dare to do, compared what Pakistan can be with what a lot of other countries have done. So for example, on Germany, you say Germany and Japan reinvented themselves, but perhaps only after that generation that came was a generation that was willing to look squarely and say, what have you done? What did we do at that time? You've compared Pakistan to perhaps China, that after Deng Xiaoping changed around completely. And then you've made, of course, also the comparison to Belgium. Explain some of that. Like, what is the Pakistan of your dreams that you imagine?
So let's look at the history of Belgium. So Belgium, there was no Belgium before 1830. Belgium was, so half of Belgium is French-speaking, half of it is Dutch-speaking. The reason why it even became a country is because it was part of what was known as the Spanish Netherlands. Spain controlled it. After the Congress of Vienna in 1815, they attempted to try and let the Dutch rule it again. But now there was a unique situation where the Dutch were all Protestant and the Belgians were Catholic. And so it wasn't a workable arrangement. Plus, these people had never known Dutch rule. They had been ruled only by the Spanish for a couple of centuries. So, the European powers decided to create a country called Belgium. The Belgians have a king and everything, but the Belgians were pretty stoic about that. They didn't try to invent a history that we've existed from the word go. When Adam and Eve landed, they landed in Brussels first. They didn't try to do that. They just moved forward. Now, Belgium was as old as Pakistan is today in 1900. 1830 to 1900. So I actually looked at that whole 1830 to 1900 Belgian experience. That how did the Belgians think of themselves in 1900? And that is the analogy with Belgium. That if Pakistan did that, you don't have to insist that we've always, okay, so there's been an India for 5,000 years. There's been a China for thousands of years. There's been a Persia for several, but not every other country has long histories. And so Pakistan does not have to pretend that it has a long history when it doesn't. Why can't we say, okay, we are a country that shared a lot of time of its history with India. Some parts of ours shared it with Afghanistan. Some parts of ours were independent. There was a state called Sindh, and the Baluch had their own quasi-autonomous, sometimes paying tribute to Persia, sometimes paying tribute to India, entity and identity. And now we are a country called Pakistan. And then start looking at moving forward. And what did the Belgians do? Two things they avoided. They decided not to compete with France. Just because half of us speak French, we have to now constantly, now I don't know how many people are Christie fans here, but Hercule Poirot always makes in a kind of a semi-joking but semi-angry way, reminds everybody that he's Belgian, not French. That's it. He didn't take it as an insult to be called French. And of course we all know that if you order French fries, what we call French fries in Belgium, they are called Belgian fries. But that's the extent. Belgium didn't set up an educational system to constantly think about how France is separate and different, how Belgium is different and separate from France. Belgium accepted its size difference, and by the way, the proportionate size difference between India and Pakistan is the same between Belgium and France, 1:6. And they moved forward. They didn't raise a huge army. Luckily, they didn't inherit a huge army. And then they didn't raise a huge army, and they didn't go for nuclear weapons to try. France has nuclear weapons, by the way. Belgium didn't say because they have them, we want them to. If Belgium had spent all their life trying to compete with France, they would have had to make a lot more chocolate than they do to succeed.
Okay. Now you're making everyone hungry. So I have just a couple more questions. One is, we cut to the present, where Pakistan is today. It's a precarious place. We don't know which way it'll head. On the one hand, it looks as if Pakistan has lost all its friends. On the other hand, it looks as if actually Pakistan has got more friends than it ever did before, if you count Russia and China and Iran and now this new deal between Pakistan and Afghanistan. If the US didn't, frankly, carry out major strikes in Pakistan when they found Osama bin Laden there, many here are skeptical about whether the US is going to do much more. So what happens next? What happens if Pakistan doesn't reimagine itself?
Well, first of all, this business of having strategic friends must be understood in the context of strategic friends through history. Strategic friends realign, and they do so when it's convenient for them. European history is particularly educative about that. So you have historic examples of Spain and Portugal and Britain being allies against Spain, but then when Spain lost relevance, then Portugal didn't want to be a British ally against France. France and Britain having entente cordiale, etc., etc., etc. So I take a very skeptical view of this fascination with strategic friendships. Strategic friendships don't increase your GDP. Strategic friendships don't make your population literate. Strategic friendships don't develop human capital. Strategic friendships don't increase your exports. I mean, for example, I was just talking in America to an audience, and I pointed out that last year, I just checked it up. I like numbers, by the way. Last year, India's exports to United States were $115 billion. Pakistan's exports, $5.5 billion. So, strategically, even if the United States becomes Pakistan's friend overnight again, this reality will not change unless Pakistan can raise its exports to 120 billion when it began. So in the end, there are more equities in America and more equities in China for India than there are for Pakistan, because the export figure is higher, etc. So these strategic friendships are very short term. They can crack very quickly. And Pakistan has a lot of experience of it. 1965, the assumption was that, okay, the Americans have told us we can't use their equipment against India, but if we do, what will they do? We are their allies. They will come to our assistance, and they didn't. So I'm asking for a realistic approach to this whole notion and go beyond the strategic business and come to terms with the bigger picture. How strong are you inside? Economy, education, fundamentals, human development, etc.
You've done 5 fault lines. So I do want to stop you there and ask, when you say look at your strength inside, you've also spoken about the comparisons to Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, and many in India have asked this question: is Pakistan going to survive? Will it break up on those fault lines?
So first of all, let me say something to Indians. Indians should not wish for misfortune for Pakistan. Indians should actually want Pakistan to be stable, strong, and reimagined. That should be the Indian agenda here. Human rights violations in Kashmir and any chorus in India about how Pakistan is either about to break up or ought to break up only feeds extremism in Pakistan with dire consequences for India. So Indians should stop being in that corner of Indians should be among Pakistan's best well-wishers. And I believe that High Commissioner Bisaria is one of those who have conveyed that to Pakistanis, that we want to be your well-wishers. And more of that needs to come, and it needs to come from the highest level. So that instead of the extremists being able to recruit that, look, we tell you they are the enemy and they are laughing or they are gloating over our misfortunes. Don't let that happen. That's an aside. And when I do the comparisons, I don't do that with malice again. And it comes through in the book quite gently, that I say some of the cracks along fault lines of nations come at a time when everybody thinks everything's okay. So I cite all the Soviet experts, including American Soviet experts, who were saying the Soviet Union is now very stable. Whence the Soviet Union actually started cracking from within. Yugoslavia, I actually quote an article about Yugoslavia the year the Yugoslav crisis started. Just 3 or 4 months before that, some journalist wrote, after traveling through Yugoslavia, how Yugoslavia was doing very well. Everybody was buying a new house. There were new McDonald's opening, etc., etc., and tourism was booming. And something happened and the crack came. So I'm just using it as a warning, not as a prediction. I'm not saying that will happen. I'm saying learn from what happened. And learn from that if your internal equilibrium is not there, then this kind of thing happens. And it has happened to others, it could happen to us also. So let's try and change that.
All right, and you've given a few of the things that you think India should do. But explain, because this is an audience that has watched this relationship, and to be fair to every government that India has had, they've tried absolutely everything. That idea that if you do the same things again and again to expect different results, but they've actually tried everything. The talks and the no talks, the people-to-people relations and the no people-to-people relations, the talking to the military, which doesn't seem to ever go anywhere, the talking to the politicians and the boosting of democracy in Pakistan. Nothing seems to change the basic idea that Pakistan still is, you know, is sending terrorists across the border,
look,
actively wanting to antagonize India in a certain
Hasni,
sense.
you know that I have been very vocal, and I don't need to be more vocal than I've already been on the subject of terrorism. I think Pakistan has to absolutely shut down the terrorist infrastructure. It absolutely has to stop making any distinction.
No, but the question is, what should India do? What works?
So, I mean, it's not my job to advise India on what to do. You know, I've done my share of advising back home, and that hasn't amounted to much. So why should I start that business on this side of the border? But let me just say that I think that take the long view instead of the short view, and don't let this become a evening television talk show driven agenda that this has to be done today or tomorrow, etc. Take the long view, and the long view ought to be that you can wait for Pakistan to change. Change in Pakistan will come from within when it does come. It's not going to come as a result of somebody squeezing. Deal with the issues that are your immediate concerns. I mean, you have a right and you have a legitimate interest in ensuring that terrorism does not continue to afflict you. That's a fair policy choice. And for that, if you have to do take certain steps by aligning with the international community to put pressure, etc., that's a policy choice. That's correct. But don't swing from what I call the Jappi Pappi option to the now we are about to destroy them day after tomorrow. And they won't exist, or saying things like, you know, we will now deal with the Baluch, and then the poor Baluch sort of don't even get visas to come to India after you realize that's not an option to be undertaken. So things like that, find that moderation and sensible approach where you just wait it out and see how it plays out. I am not actually even talking about what the world ought to do. This is the first book in which I do very little of what the world should be doing in relation to Pakistan. I am trying more and more to talk to Pakistanis in this book, that this is where we stand. It's kind of many years ago I had read a book which some Britisher had written. State of Our Nation was the title. I remember it impressed me very much, because what this person did was he just went through a sweeping thing of, you know, how good is our primary education, how good is Britain, you know, like where do we stand? Because sometimes nations start giving them, and by the way, some Indians should do that for India, you know, where do you stand? Because sometimes you can go into a nationalist mold and say everything's great, or you can go into a pessimistic mode and say, oh God, everything's falling apart. Sometimes you just have to have a realistic assessment. So I'm doing that realistic assessment, and I think India's policy towards Pakistan should be based on a similar realistic assessment. Protect your equities, protect your interests, make sure terrorism issue is addressed to your security needs, make sure that you have a reasonable relationship with your own population, including those who may live in a disputed state called Jammu and Kashmir, but who are currently administered by you. So you have to have a relationship with your own people, and you have to deal with all those things. Don't do it as a means of trying to change Pakistan, because Pakistan is not going to change because of something India does. Pakistan is going to change because of something we Pakistanis end up doing.
All right, and we hope for you that you will get as good an audience for your book in Pakistan, or readership, as we have an audience this evening.
Well,
thanks so much.
Readership has always been good in Pakistan, so I'm glad that a lot of people read my works in Pakistan, and I do influence ideas there, even if I'm